This news, Millet is the son of Echevarria's longtime partner, and he had been staying at his home for some time. He then allegedly stomped on his head, stabbed him more than a dozen times with an ice pick.
A suitcase floating in the East River in the middle of a February afternoon in one of the most watched cities in the world. The ferry captain spotted it first, bobbing in the gray water near Governor's Island. Heavy, too heavy to pull aboard. Heavy in the specific terrible way that made the crew stop what they were doing and called 911, without fully understanding why they felt the need to do it so urgently. When NYPD Harbor Unit officers opened that suitcase at Pier 16 in the financial district, what they found inside changed the direction of an entire investigation. A man's torso, zipped into a sleeping bag, stuffed inside a suitcase with a faded luggage tag still attached. That luggage tag, that single, faded, overlooked detail left behind by a killer who thought the East River would swallow his secret hole became the thread that unraveled everything. His name was Edwin Echevarria. He was 65 years old, a retired postal worker from the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a man his family described as kind-hearted, generous, the kind of person who helped people when they needed it. That generosity and instinct to open his home to someone who needed a place to stay is what ultimately cost him his life. Stay with me, because this story is not just about a murder. This is about what happens when a killer underestimates a luggage tag, when he forgets that the details he considers small are the ones investigators consider everything. He thought the river would keep his secret. It didn't. To understand what happened inside apartment 60 Columbia Street on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, you first have to understand who Edwin Echevarria was. Edwin was 65 years old. He had spent his working life as a postal worker, one of those quiet, essential jobs that the city depends on and rarely thinks about. He had recently retired. He was, by all accounts, a man who had earned the right to a quieter life, a man who had worked hard, kept his head down, and taken care of the people around him. His nephew Eric Maldonado would speak to journalists in the days after Edwin's remains were found. He described his uncle in terms that were simple and specific and heartbreaking in their ordinariness. Kind-hearted, Eric said. If you needed something, Edwin was able to help you. That was just how Edwin was. Edwin Echevarria lived in the Baruch Houses, a public housing complex on the Lower East Side, in the shadow of the Williamsburg Bridge, in the specific dense, layered, intimate way that Manhattan. Neighborhoods stack lives on top of each other and beside each other and expect everyone to manage the proximity. And Edwin had done what kind-hearted people sometimes do. He had given someone a place to live. That someone was Christian Millet, 23 years old, a young man who had, according to investigators, been periodically living with Edwin Echevarria for some time, moving in and out, being given access to Edwin's home and Edwin's space and Edwin's generosity in the way that Edwin apparently gave those things without calculating the cost, without measuring the risk. Edwin's family said Echevarria would call Millet his grandson. His grandson. He had taken this young man in as family. And that trust, that open, uncalculating, generous trust, is where this story begins its darkest chapter. Here is the detail that stops people cold when they first encounter this case. The argument that allegedly triggered this murder, the dispute that investigators say escalated from words to violence, to something that went so far beyond ordinary human comprehension that it required the East River and a suitcase and a sleeping bag to attempt to contain it. It was about food. Food, not money. Not a long-standing grudge with years of accumulated grievance behind it. Not a dispute over. Something that the outside world might struggle to understand, but could at least recognize as having weight. Food. According to investigators, sometime in late January or early February 2025, Edwin Echevarria and a Christian Millet got into an argument inside the apartment on Columbia Street. The argument was about food. It had apparently not been the first argument they had had. Investigators would later note that Millet and Echevarria had multiple arguments over several years, a pattern of friction between two people, sharing a space that had been building in ways that those around them may not have fully understood. But this argument did not stay an argument. According to prosecutors, Christian Millet knocked Edwin Echevarria to the ground. While Edwin was on the ground, a 65-year-old retired man on the floor of the home he had opened. To this young man, Millet allegedly stomped on his head, kicked him, and then took a kitchen knife and stabbed Edwin Echevarria approximately 12 to 13 times in the torso. 12 to 13 times. With a kitchen knife from the apartment they shared. Edwin Echevarria did not survive. And what Christian Millet did next, what he allegedly did in the hours that followed, alone in that apartment on Columbia Street, with a body and a problem and a decision to make, is what transforms this case from a terrible act of violence into something that crosses into the territory of the genuinely horrifying. Investigators believe that after Edwin Echevarria was dead, Christian Millet did not call for help, did not panic in the way that might lead a person to make a desperate public mistake, did not flee. He stayed, and he made a cold, deliberate, methodical decision about how to manage what he had done. He took a kitchen knife and he dismembered Edwin Echevarria's body in the bathtub of the apartment. He wrapped the body parts in bags. He placed Edwin's torso in a sleeping bag and then placed that sleeping bag inside a suitcase that still had a luggage tag attached, a faded tag with a name on it that Millet apparently either didn't notice or didn't think mattered. He then, prosecutors believe, transported that suitcase from the apartment on Columbia Street to the East River. The geography of this matters. The Baruch houses sit close to the waterfront. The Corliers Hook Ferry Station is nearby. The Delancey, Street Bridge, and Pier 42 are accessible from that neighborhood on foot. The Manhattan Bridge, pedestrian walkway, which runs adjacent to lanes of traffic and overlooks the water, is reachable. At some point, investigators believe, Christian Millet found a way to put a suitcase containing the torso of the man who had called him his grandson into the East River. And then he went back to the apartment, where blood-soaked towels and a screwdriver were later found by investigators, where the bathroom told its own forensic story. He went back, he stayed, and he apparently believed that the river would do the work he needed it to do. He was wrong. February 5th, 2025, 5:30 in the afternoon. The Susan B. Anthony ferry was moving through the cold water near Governor's Island when the captain spotted something, a suitcase, floating in the East River, bobbing on the frigid February surface with the specific quality of something that has weight but has not yet gone under. The crew attempted to retrieve it. They couldn't. It was too heavy. They called 911. NYPD Harbor Unit officers responded. They retrieved the suitcase and transported it to Pier 16 in the financial district. They opened it. Inside was a sleeping bag. Inside the sleeping bag was a man's torso. The discovery was made, logged, and sent to the medical examiner's office. At that point, the torso was unidentified. The identity of the victim was unknown. The connection between the suitcase and the apartment on Columbia Street had not yet been made. But investigators had something. They had the suitcase itself, and on the suitcase, faded, but still legible, still attached, still there was a luggage tag with a name. It was not Edwin Echevarria's name, but as investigators began pulling on that thread, cross-referencing the address, speaking to people in the building, comparing the identification on that tag with the records they were building, the picture began to come into focus. Missing person reports in the area, Edwin Echevarria's family who had not heard from him, the apartment on Columbia Street. Within days of the discovery, investigators had a name for the victim, and within days of identifying the victim, they had a name for the suspect, the man who had lived in that apartment with Edwin, the man Edwin had called his grandson. February 12th, 2025. 1 week after the suitcase was found floating in the East River, Christian Millett was taken into custody at his home. Detectives brought him to the 7th Precinct Station House for questioning. And here, in the specific, pressured procedural atmosphere of a police interview, something happened that sealed the case in a way that the forensic evidence, as powerful as it was, could not have done alone. Christian Millett made statements. According to investigators, he made statements linking himself directly to the crime. He allegedly described what had happened, the argument, the violence, apparently framing it as the result of the ongoing dispute over food. He talked in the way that people sometimes talk when the weight of what they have been carrying becomes too much to hold. When the construction of the lie, maintained for days, begins to buckle under the pressure of being inside a police precinct with detectives who already know more than they have told him yet. He was charged with murder in the 2nd degree and concealment of a human corpse. On February 13th, 2025, detectives walked Christian Millett out of the 7th Precinct in handcuffs and into a waiting police car. A missing person flyer for Edwin Echevarria put up by neighbors and family members who had been searching for him since he disappeared was visible on the street outside. Edwin's face on a flyer as the man accused of killing him was walking past it. In the momentum of a case like this, the discovery, the investigation, the arrest, the courtroom, it is easy for the victim to become a detail, a name in a headline, the person the story is technically about, but that the narrative somehow moves past in its urgency to describe the crime and catch the killer. Edwin Echevarria deserves more than that. He was 65 years old. He had spent his career as a postal worker, a job that required reliability, punctuality, physical endurance, and the kind of quiet, steady commitment to showing up that most people take for granted in the services that make their lives function. He had retired. He was at the stage of his life that a person reaches after decades of work, the stage where the mornings are your own, where the pace slows down, where the things you work toward become the things you now have time to enjoy. He had a family who loved him, a nephew who spoke about him in the days after his death with a grief that was uncomplicated and real. Eric Maldonado described his uncle as someone who was there when you needed him, someone whose instinct, when he encountered a person who needed help, was to help. That instinct had led him to give Christian Millett access to his home. It had led him to call a young man with nowhere stable to go to his grandson. It led him to extend the kind of practical, concrete generosity that costs something: your space, your privacy, your peace, and that most people are not willing to offer. Edwin Echevarria was willing, and the person he offered it to stabbed him 13 times over a dispute about food and dismembered his body in a bathtub. There is no framework that makes that proportionate, no context that closes the gap between what Edwin did extending kindness and what was done to him in return. Some things resist explanation. They simply have to be held. When investigators searched the apartment on Columbia Street, what they found told a story that was independent of anything Christian Millett said or didn't say. Blood-soaked towels, a screwdriver, a bathroom that forensic examination indicated had been the site of significant violence and subsequent attempts at concealment. The suitcase in the East River had already provided a torso, a sleeping bag, a reusable grocery store bag, tucked inside alongside the remains, and a luggage tag, that crucial, overlooked, devastating luggage tag. That gave investigators the thread they needed to pull. No other body parts were recovered from the river. The rest of Edwin Echevarria, the pieces that investigators say Millett cut away with a kitchen knife and wrapped in bags, have not been found. They remain somewhere in the geography of Manhattan, in the river, or in the infrastructure of a city that absorbs and conceals more than its residents ever fully know. The medical examiner worked with what they had. The manner of death was confirmed as homicide, and the prosecution built its case from multiple directions simultaneously. The forensic evidence from the Churm apartment, the suitcase and its contents, the luggage tag and what it revealed, and the statements Christian Millett made when detectives sat across from him in the 7th Precinct station house and let him talk. Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg called it a shocking and brutal murder. In August 2025, a grand jury indicted Christian Millett on charges of murder in the 2nd degree, concealment of a human corpse, and related counts. He was held without bail at the Eric M. Taylor Center on Rikers Island. Here is the question that sits underneath the facts of this case and refuses to be answered by them. How? How does an argument about food, the most basic and ordinary of daily frictions, escalate to this, to a man dead on the floor of his own apartment, to a body in a bathtub, to a suitcase in a river, to a family? Putting missing person flyers on lampposts in a neighborhood where the man they are looking for was killed by the person he had called family. Forensic psychologists and criminologists who study violence in domestic and shared living situations describe a particular dynamic that can develop between people who share intimate space over extended periods of time. Small frictions accumulate. The thing about shared living, especially in the compressed, pressured environment of a small New York city apartment, is that minor irritations have nowhere to go. There is no physical distance to put between yourself and the person who is annoying you. No room to decompress, to reset, to let the irritation dissipate before it hardens into resentment. And resentment over time in people who have never developed healthy mechanisms for managing conflict and anger can build into something that becomes disproportionate to the trigger. Investigators noted that Millett and Echevarria had multiple arguments over several years. This was not the first time the friction between them had broken into conflict. The food dispute, whatever specific form it took on that day in early 2025, was likely not experienced by Millett as an isolated incident, but as the latest in a cumulative series of perceived slights and frustrations. none of which, in any rational calculation, adds up to what happened. But rationality is not what operates in the moment when accumulated resentment finally ignites. In that moment, what operates is something older and more animal rage, without architecture, fury, without a ceiling. And Edwin Echevarria, 65 years old, a retired postal worker who had extended kindness to a young man who needed it, paid the price for the accumulated anger of a person whose capacity to manage that anger had collapsed entirely. But what often surprises investigators in cases like this is how ordinary the final trigger can be. Not a dramatic betrayal, not a carefully planned act of revenge. Just a moment where frustration turns into anger, anger turns into violence, and violence crosses a line that cannot be uncrossed. Criminologists sometimes describe this as a threshold moment, the exact point where a person stops, thinking about consequences and acts purely on emotion. Once that line is crossed, everything changes, because after the violence ends, reality returns. The silence in the room becomes unbearable, and the person responsible suddenly understands something terrifying. There is no way to undo what has already been done. That realization is often the moment when panic replaces rage and the desperate attempt to hide the crime begins. New York City is not a place that easily gives up its secrets. It is a city of 8 million people layered on top of each other, moving through the same spaces, sharing walls and lifts and subway cars without ever really knowing who the person beside them is. A city where you can disappear into the crowd in a way that is impossible in smaller places, where the sheer density of life creates a kind of anonymity that is both one of the city's great freedoms and, in cases like this one of its great vulnerabilities. Christian Millett had counted on that anonymity. He had counted on the river, on the cold February water, to take the suitcase and its contents somewhere, unreachable, on the city's size and noise, and constant forward movement to swallow what had happened in the apartment on Columbia Street before anyone had a chance to look closely. He had almost been right. The suitcase had been in the water. It had been moving with the current, away from the Baruch houses, and the 7th Precinct and everything that connected it to what had happened. The torso inside it was unidentified. There was no immediate trail leading back to Columbia Street, but a ferry captain noticed a suitcase that was floating slightly too low in the water, and a crew that tried to pull it aboard could not because it was too heavy. And the NYPD Harbor Unit retrieved it and transported it to a pier and opened it. And there was a luggage tag, a faded name on a tag that the killer had apparently not noticed or not thought significant, or had simply failed to account for in the specific, terrible arithmetic of trying to dispose of a human being in the middle of a city of 8 million people. That tag connected the suitcase to an address. That address connected investigators to Edwin Echevarria. Edwin Echevarria connected investigators to the man who had been living in his apartment. And the city that almost kept the secret gave it up because of a detail so small that most people would have overlooked it entirely. August 7th, 2025. A Manhattan grand jury indicted Christian Millett on charges of murder in the 2nd degree and concealment of a human corpse. He remained held at Rikers Island without bail, awaiting trial in one of the most documented, scrutinized court systems in the world, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which had called this case what it was from the outset, without softening the language: a shocking and brutal murder. Edwin Echevarria's family continued to live with the aftermath of what had been done to a man who had been, by every account, simply trying to help. Eric Maldonado had spoken publicly about his uncle in the days after the arrest, carefully, with the specific restraint of a person who is trying to communicate the reality of who someone was without losing themselves to the grief of what was done to them. He was kind-hearted, Eric said. That's how Edwin was. Those words, simple, honest, specific, carry more weight than any legal language. They describe a person, not a victim in a case file, not a body in a suitcase, not a torso in the East River. A person who was kind-hearted, who helped people when they needed it, who called a young man his grandson and opened his door and asked for nothing in return except the ordinary, decent reciprocity of shared space and shared life. He did not get that. He got 12 to 13 stab wounds and a bathtub and a river. And somewhere in the waters around Manhattan, the rest of Edwin Echevarria still has not been found. A luggage tag. That is what this case came down to in the end. Not a confession freely given, not a witness who came forward, not a surveillance camera that caught the right moment at the right angle. A faded name on a tag attached to a suitcase that was floating in the east. River on a cold February afternoon. Too heavy for a ferry crew to pull out of the water on their own. A detail so small that a killer moving through the specific pressured urgency of trying to dispose of a human being apparently didn't notice it, didn't think to look for it, didn't account for it in whatever calculation he was making when he zipped a sleeping bag into a suitcase and carried it to the waters. Edwin Echevarria was 65 years old. He was a retired postal worker. He was the kind of person who helped people when they needed it, who opened his home to a young man with nowhere stable to go, and called him his grandson, and extended the kind of trust that most of us are careful about, and that Edwin apparently was not. That trust cost him everything. Christian Millett, the young man Edwin had called family, allegedly stabbed him 13 times over a dispute about food, dismembered his body in the bathtub of the apartment Edwin owned, and attempted to hide him in a river. He is 23 years old. He is sitting on Rikers Island waiting for a trial that will determine the rest of his life. And Edwin's family is living with the specific, unresolvable grief of a loss that was not just violent, but contemptuous. That took a man who had given generously and treated what he gave as disposable. There is a missing person flyer somewhere on the Lower East Side with Edwin Echevarria's face on it, put there by people who loved him, looking for a man who was already gone. The river almost kept the secret. A luggage tag made sure it couldn't. Edwin Echevarria deserved better than the East River and a suitcase. He deserved the ordinary, decent end that kind-hearted people are owed. He did not get it, but he got his name, spoken clearly so that it cannot be forgotten. Edwin, say his name. The most dangerous assumption any of us can make is that we know who the people around us really are. Edwin Echevarria opened his door to someone he trusted, and the city of 8 million people almost swallowed the truth of what happened to him. Almost. Next week, a case where the killer lived in the same house as the investigation for years, and nobody knew.